Okay, I'll call to order the meeting of the Ordinance Committee of the Santa Barbara City Council for April 27th. Ms. Peterson, would you please call the roll?
Chair Bendy White.
Here.
Grant House. Frank Hotchkiss.
Here.
Thank you. And then would you please announce the first item on our agenda?
Sure. The first item on the agenda today is the Municipal Code update regarding registered domestic partners. And the presentation today will be by the Human Resources Manager, Barbara Barker.
Thank you. Ms. Barker?
Good afternoon. I am Barbara Barker. I'm the Human Resources Manager, and I am here regarding the amendment to add registered domestic partners to Municipal Code Section 3.16073. Currently, this code section covers employment-related conflicts of interest that may occur when employees, spouses, and/or relatives also work for the city. And since employment-related conflicts of interest may occur not only for spouses and their relatives, but also for registered domestic partners, we would like to add registered domestic partners to this code section language. This amendment also includes a definition that registered domestic partners are those individuals who have registered either through the Santa Barbara City Clerk's Office, the state of California, or any other local municipal, county, or state domestic partner registry, and also includes the statement that the term marriage, as used in the Charter Section 710 related to nepotism, will also encompass registered domestic partners. So if you're good with that change, then come back to Council in May with the introduction.
Thank you. Do we have any speakers on this one, Ms. Peterson? Okay. Mr. Hotchkiss, do you have any pearls of wisdom to bestow on us on this topic?
Do it.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, so is that a motion?
That is a motion.
All right. I'll second it. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. So ordered.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Barker?
Is that called a rubber stamp? I don't know.
Well, it's just excellent staff work is
Yeah,
what that's
absolutely.
called.
And brilliant commission work. too.
Firm. Thank you. That's on its way. So we understand there he is. All right, so we will move on to the next item on our agenda. Ms. Peterson, would you kindly announce that?
The second item is the medical marijuana storefront collective ordinance revisions. And this item will be presented by Danny Cato, our senior planner.
Thank you, Mr. Cato.
Good afternoon. Thank you. We are here, well, hopefully for the last time for this round, to look at, review the draft of the revised medical marijuana storefront collective storefront dispensary ordinance. And the name gets longer every time, it seems like, but I think you get the idea. What happened last time, 2 weeks ago, the Ordinance Committee came to consensus on a large number of items, and all those items have been put into this ordinance that's attached to the CAR that you have. And the idea was to come back one last time because it got so confusing the last time with all the different changes and the single strikeout and the double strikeout and the consensus items. So now you have in front of you a blank, not a blank, but an unstrikeout copy that shows everything. And hopefully we'll get a recommendation from the Ordinance Committee today for Council. There are a couple of outstanding items. Okay, let me just, now that the projector is ready, the consensus points that the Ordinance Committee got to last time, all the recommendations from the previous round of Ordinance Committee recommendations that were presented to Council on February 23rd. Storefronts to be operated by collectives, to be not for profit. Collective members must reside in the Tri-County area, that's San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara, and Ventura counties. Cultivation, membership, and financial records are required, and inspection would be on limited notice. Medical records would have to be kept, and those would be available only through a search warrant or inspection warrant. And like I said, dispensary inspection with limited notice, maximum of 5 storefront collectives, and prohibition of storefront collectives within 500 feet or so of the 17 major high-priority recovery facilities. We allow them to be in the Upper West Side medical facility area, and so there's a little bit of miscommunication between us and the city attorney's office. So we've called it 2 different things depending on where you look. We've called it the Upper West Side medical facility area, and we've also called it the West Pueblo medical facility area. So you could choose which one you want it to be. Prohibit them in the Mesa area and still allowable in edible form. 2 items that we talked about last time, which you asked for, well, one you asked for some additional discussion from the staff, and then one we wanted to maybe talk about more here. And that was, first one, the Santa Barbara Patients Group, the current dispensaries at 3128 State Street. The Ordinance Committee asked staff to look into some way of making that allowable to remain. And maybe I'll let Mr. Wiley talk about it a bit more, but we couldn't find a good way to do that. That didn't just single it out. So that's something that we'd like to, you could discuss. And then the second, that we had a little bit of preliminary discussion last time, but wanted to keep till after all the consensus items had been reached. And that is, what is the process going to be? Right now, it is review and approval by the staff hearing officer, which is appealable to planning commission, and then through the new revision, appealable to council. And the question or the idea is, we've locked this down pretty tight now as far as the number in town, where they can be, the areas that they can be in, one per area, et cetera, and all the different or even more operational requirements than there used to be. And the question became, well, since we've locked it down so tight, do we need a discretionary review process, or can it just be something that happens at the staff level, whether it's through finance or community development or the police department? And that's a discussion that, like I said, the Ordinance Committee started, but wanted to get full consensus and then come back. So those are the 2 sort of outstanding items, and then just reviewing all the language to make sure it's what you expect. So our recommendation is to review the draft ordinance, discuss those 2 items, and make recommendations to council. And the next steps, state law requires that all amendments to the zoning ordinance be reviewed by the planning commission, and the planning commission makes recommendations to council. We did that for the first set back in December, and they made their recommendations. But because the ordinance has changed fairly substantially, city attorney's opinion is that we need to go back to planning commission one more time. So that will be happening May 13th, which is 2 weeks from day after tomorrow. And then council, as soon as we can get back on the agenda after that. So that's the next steps, and that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Cato. Questions for staff? Mr. Hotchkiss?
Yeah, Mr. Cotto, we didn't mention the so-called State Street corridor, but that is mentioned in the draft ordinance itself, correct? Prohibition along State Street from Cabrillo to Arriaga, I think it was?
Yes, Chair White and Councilmember Hotchkiss, that has always been part of the ordinance, and that hasn't changed. So I didn't mention it, but it is still in here.
Okay. I've got other questions, but we can do these later.
As you wish. Mr. House, you want to have a question you would like to ask now?
Yeah, I have.
Okay.
I just have a few things that oh yeah, maybe I could. I just got 3 things that I wanted to ask our staff. I can do that right now, just for clarification.
Later after comment.
I'm okay with it now if you want to.
Let me just take these on right now, it might settle some little tiny things. I get my page here. I had a question on page 11, and let's see if I can recreate this for myself. And I'm glad that Mr. Martell is here today. It talked on number 3 on that page, talks about criteria for issuance, and maybe this is not exactly the right place, but the concern I had is we talk about calls for service in here, And there's a couple places where we talk about if there were a lot of calls for service. And I know that in the entertainment district, we are careful not to discourage the business owners from calling the police department for assistance. In other words, they aren't dinged for a call where they call to have assistance for something. If they violate something, and that's the nature of the call for service, or that's a different thing. But both here, this had to do with the criteria for issuance, but then later it had to do with the revocation type situation. How do we handle that? Well, we want to encourage them to call for the assistance when they need it, and not and not ding them if they did have somebody trying to rob them or something. And yet the language that's in here seems to indicate that a call for service might be seen as a bad thing if they were initiating that call for assistance.
Martell?
Yes, Chair and committee members, you're absolutely right that we do distinguish between them, calls for service, or calls for assistance, or just a call for service where there's an incident involving the business. So we do look at the statistical data, look at what generated it. I would not hold it against a business. In fact, I really support businesses to report crime or prevent crime by reporting things that are suspicious in nature that may not even rise to the level of a reportable crime. So, no, I would say that no, it would not. We would actually really spend a lot of time on evaluating the data before we make a decision on this point.
Okay. I guess as I looked through, I just was looking at that, and I wanted to know that the police department would use that kind of discretion, just like we do for the entertainment area of town.
That's correct.
Okay. And then there was a question that was, I thought we had discussed this on page 14, number 5, at the top. Let's see if I've got it right here. And this is for Mr. Wiley. Mr. Wiley, we talked about what if somebody who is there to do a repair or work on the property that's not a member of the collective. Is there a way for us to distinguish this in any way? Because we're identifying here that there's, of course, only primary caregivers and qualified patients and members of the collective dispensary are really allowed in the premises. Is there a need anywhere in there for us? We were discussing this last time to identify that there's probably some other reason for somebody to be there, and how do you do that?
Mr. House, if you'd look at page 13, number 3, it's not a full answer to your question, but at the bottom there, page number 3, only collective members as primary caregivers or qualified patients shall be permitted within a storefront dispensary building for the purposes of cultivating, processing, or distributing medical marijuana. So if a plumber were there to fix the plumbing, he would say, I was here to fix the plumbing. I was not here for the purposes of obtaining marijuana. That would be the building, the general building itself. Then this number 5 is just the designated marijuana dispensing area. And I'm assuming that's fairly small, and
it's not that big of a deal. I was just
Yeah.
I wanted to be sure that we didn't ace out the electrician that's coming in to do some repair or something.
I'm pretty sure we would not not prosecute or hassle anyone that was there, working there as a workman with this language.
Okay, then the one that we had discussed, and it's on page 16 at the very top, number 2. And it says storefront collective dispensary operations shall not result in illegal redistribution or sale of medical marijuana obtained from the collective dispensary, et cetera. And I don't think we disagree, any of us would disagree that we don't want that to happen, but how do we have that be how does that work in terms of holding the dispensary responsible for something that somebody does after they've left that they have no control over? That language bothered me last time, and I'm wondering.
It would be a matter of proof. If it happened once in a blue moon, I think the city staff, the police department, would not be at all inclined to say, we're gonna hold that dispensary operator or the management member responsible for it. But if it happened on a regular basis, and we had evidence of that this is pretty closely connected with the verification that someone that is receiving medical marijuana then and there still has a current valid status as a qualified patient, that their note is not forged. So let's just use that. If we found many instances of accepting forged notes and not verifying them, we would say, you're violating this language here, and we're possibly going to initiate a revocation process to pull your permit. So I know it's not a black and white answer, but that's sort of the way you have to prove a case like this, just that it's more than an isolated incident.
Okay, thank you. That was it. Those are the questions I had. Maybe staff
Thank
can
you,
help
Mr.
on
Hess.
that a little more.
Mr. Cato?
Chair White, I just wanted to mention that every single application that we've processed, when we ask people, how are you going to meet this? How are you going to make sure that your clients aren't illegally redistributing medical marijuana? And I think all of them, if not all of them, just about all of them, say that they have basically a one strike rule. If they find out that one of their members is illegally redistributing, then they're out. That's what we've been told in just about every application we've reviewed.
Martel?
Yeah, I also like to add that the city attorney is correct that we do an investigation, and if we found out, and in most investigations where a dispensary was involved, we would go back to the dispensary and inform them of that. And I think it'll really dovetail into the annual review of these things. So, like the city attorney says, if we have repetitive issues, then we can address it then.
Great. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. Those are the questions I had up front.
Mr. Hotchkiss?
I think what we're saying is we just need language like this in here to carry forward if the need be. Correct?
That's correct.
Great. Thanks.
All right, I'll open the public.
Mr. Chair,
Oh,
can I
Mr. Wiley?
address at the end of the last meeting, the committee asked us to look at possibly drafting language that might grandfather in the existing dispensary located at 3128 State Street. And Mr. Cotto and I looked at that a lot of different ways. And, my concern from a legal standpoint was to not do what is called special legislation in a way that's considered improper, where you're just blatantly singling out a particular operator and grandfathering them in or whatever it might be. I mean, special legislation can be legal, particularly with zoning laws and grandfathering in existing legal operations. But we just couldn't find a rationale that would be, in our opinion, fairly defensible. For example, we looked at when the business tax certificates were issued for our existing legal dispensaries, and possibly there's a cutoff date. We looked at, certain dates where ordinances were adopted, and if some of the legal existing ones fell prior to those dates, just couldn't really find a way to do it that didn't amount to identifying a particular operator at a particular location and say this one's okay. And that's why I'm not recommending it. I'm a little concerned about the legality of that. But I have to say, it's really your call. I mean, we could, the concern here, for example, we could have said, and I believe counsel for this applicant or this operator looked at this as well. We could have said, well, despite the fact that the 3100 block of State Street's right across from McKinsey Park, we're going to make that block a permissible location. But I think to say that, we would probably be assuming this operator and this operation, and that then allowing dispensaries in the 3100 block would be maybe a little too broad, because we could, who knows what's going to change in the future. And it is no question, it's not within 500 feet of a park. It's right there across the street from a park. So that was a bit more than I think we were prepared to recommend. But if the committee wants to consider it, I believe the operator's attorney would like that. We just couldn't think of a way to do it. And I believe that this operator also wanted to raise the issue, and maybe he'll get into it, of edible marijuana, medical marijuana products. And this ordinance, this draft ordinance, does not prohibit the distribution of edible medical marijuana, but he had an issue with respect to who bakes, who prepares the edible, and I'm prepared to come up with some language to clarify that the person who prepares or the business that bakes an edible would not be violating the city's ordinance. It really is a bit of a more of a state law issue, but I think there is actually language in the state law that could be referenced about assisting primary caregivers, and I think someone who baked medical marijuana and didn't sell it or transfer it themselves would be providing assistance to a primary caregiver.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. All right, now I will open up the public testimony, and I'll start with Derek Weston, followed by Jan Lemberger.
Thank you very much. Derek Weston for the Santa Barbara Patients Group. Heather Poet-Johnson has filed a speaker slip and will cede time, but I'll try to be very brief. We appreciated that you all three said last week that it is appropriate that dispensaries that are otherwise permissible be allowed to offer edibles. And we think it would be very good to have additional language. I've suggested some, which Mr. Wiley has looked at. It doesn't have to be that way. We think it may be hard for us to get providers to work with us unless they know that they will be covered by city language. So we actually think that would be very helpful and have suggested language. Second, we really, really appreciate the support you've given for Santa Barbara Patients Group operation and your effort to include the 3100 block. I think the only way to do it would be to accept that the 3100 block per se is a permissible location, even if it were a different operator. If you are comfortable with that, then maybe it's something that should be left in the ordinance and we can see if we can find a solution. I certainly don't want to do anything that staff and Mr. Wiley aren't comfortable with, but it would be nice to have the option. We've listened very carefully to Mr. House's comments on the ordinance. I think they are well taken. My own take on page 16 is that the language operations is what provides the protection. A dispensary is not in violation if there is a resale. They're in violation if their operations are sloppy so that it results in resale. So I think that language is probably fine. And then last of all, I sent you a letter encouraging you to go back to what I understand is the current Santa Barbara ordinance, which is use of the term cannabis instead of marijuana. I think that terminology really matters. None of us would consider calling it the Santa Barbara pot ordinance. We just wouldn't because it's inappropriate. Marijuana does not have that same pejorative context. But cannabis is much better. You're doing this for medical reasons. You're doing it to protect the legitimate medicinal use of marijuana. And I think by using cannabis as a term, you help set the stage, you set the framework, the context in which it's discussed. It's my understanding, although to be honest I hadn't realized it, that the current ordinance uses cannabis and that it was recently changed. So those are our comments. I want to compliment you on the process that you have followed. It's been long, arduous, difficult, but it's a very impressive process. You have paid attention to the substance and I think made huge strides forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weston.
Steve about that.
Jen Lenberger, followed by Tony Vasallo. Hello.
My name is Jen Lemberger, and I stand before you once again as a citizen, community member, and individual working with youth and adults dealing with recovery and towards prevention. We once again just ask you to truly stand on the side of schools and youth facilities, as well as recovery and treatment-related facilities, and what we have continuously asked respectfully of the Ordinance Committee. And as well, pertinent to today's issues, we really believe that the issue of the appeal, it should be ensured that it is allowable to go to the City Council. With such a hotbed issue as this, it shouldn't end at the Planning Commission. And we ask you to please look at the greater realm of this issue and represent the larger community and the wishes that we have put forward from all the varying viewpoints that have stood before you, and to be prudent and truly err on the side of caution with your decisions on this issue.
Thank you very much. Tony Vasallo, followed by Janet Rouse.
Good morning, good afternoon, I guess now. Tony Vasallo, West Downtown resident. You know, the trend is interesting because a few months ago we had around 125 cities in California that banned storefronts, and now we have over 220 California cities that have banned the storefronts. So it's an interesting trend and something I think the committee should take into consideration. But I read the ordinance quickly this morning. Sorry, I'm not feeling that well, but the ordinance seems to defer to the state for the collective cooperative definition, when I thought that was the charge that the City Council gave your committee to figure out what a definition is. Also, I noticed that preschool has not been added to the definition of school in the ordinance, and we would hope that that would be included. Another point is on the entity itself. The cooperative legal entity is more strict than the collective entity, legal entity. So wouldn't it be better for storefronts to be required to be a cooperative legal entity rather than a collective legal entity? That one requires more disclosure. I'm also in favor of a conditional use permit and full public hearings with right to appeal to City Council, because specific conditions can be added to a CUP on a location-by-location basis. I'll quickly go through a couple of others. There really is no clause in the ordinance that says sale of medical marijuana is prohibited. That would be great if there was a clause in the ordinance that actually specified specifically the sale of medical marijuana is prohibited. That's in line with state law. The ordinance does say that no profit can be made, so I'm wondering why we have storefronts at all. Disagree with the tri-county cultivation. It's way too inclusive. Are we going to have inspectors driving up to San Luis Obispo County to inspect grows? We don't even have enough resources to provide within our city boundaries, let alone do that. And I think membership should be restricted to the city of Santa Barbara, because we don't really have a requirement to provide medical cannabis to anybody outside of our city, so why do it? Opposed to having vending machines anywhere, including the dispensaries. And I feel that the non-conforming and illegal operating dispensaries should count as one, so that no permits are provided or given out until we clear up that matter. Thank you.
I have a question for you, though.
Yes, sir.
And that is the cooperative. You were asking about. You were saying that the cooperative is stricter than the collective.
It's my understanding that the cooperative legal entity form is stricter and requires more disclosure for tax purposes to the state and than the cooperative model does.
Okay, I'll follow up with our counsel on that. Thank you. Janet Rouse, to be followed by Anna Marie.
Hi there again. I guess I just would like to say that I hope that when you take it from here forward, that you will really consider that there's a large group of Santa Barbarans who are not here and who have not been able to participate, and that you're charged with coming up with an ordinance that's going to serve the greater good, and it seems that this ordinance is all about a minority. And so I think that that's something really important to keep in mind. I agree with some of the other speakers who noticed that our ordinance still does not define what it is you're doing, if it's a collective or, as Tony just suggested, a cooperative model. I believe you're going toward a collective, but if the goal to come back to the committee was to come up with definitions, and that to solve that you're going to say, well, we're going to go with what's in the state law, that's not good enough for the lay people of Santa Barbara who need to understand what your ordinance is trying to control. So I suggest that you put in, if you want to just take what's in the state and put it in your ordinance, I think that's better than nothing. I think you should at least duplicate what's there. And I really strongly suggest you stay within state law. I have a lot of concerns still with the method that you're putting forward for us to accept And frankly, we don't really accept it. We have a lot of concerns, and you've heard them. So our concerns are still with the kids and the youth. And if you're going to promote marijuana, then it's going to make it much harder for people to prevent drug abuse. And having storefronts is, in fact, promoting marijuana. And as to the word cannabis, it's really important to keep in mind that Prop 215 is the medical marijuana proposition. It's not a cannabis initiative. So that's a term that we know, those of us who've been watching, that's a term that's used for marketing. And it's trying to put a nice little spin on marijuana and pot and drugs and dealers and dope. And now they want us to accept cannabis. So please don't do that. Thank you very much, and remember the kids.
Thank you, Ms. Rouse. Anne Marie?
Council members, I've got a few items that I'd like to have you and Mr. Wiley perhaps clarify or review certain sections within the ordinance, and one technical question that I have. There are 4 things that I'd like to talk about. One is, can someone clarify that the ordinance does not prohibit the delivery of medical marijuana to a member of a collective who is located within the zones described as high priority recovery facilities, schools, or parks. Collective members who are located within these areas or near these areas should have access to medical marijuana through a delivery service, and this ordinance should state if it excludes collective delivery services from the ordinance or prohibits collective members from receiving medicine from a collective delivery service if they live near such facilities. The second item, in section 28.80.020, item I, titled Property, and item D, titled Medical Marijuana Storefront Collective Dispensary or Storefront Collective Dispensary, seems to include non-storefront collective dispensaries when it describes members associated at a location or property where members collectively or cooperatively cultivate medical marijuana. I'd like to ask that it be made clear that members of a collective who collectively or cooperatively cultivate medical marijuana for their members without a storefront be excluded from the ordinance. Additionally, in section 28.80.020, item L, titled Reasonable Compensation, in this section, I do agree with it, with the exception of the last sentence. Now, nonprofits actually include bonuses, which are management by objectives, MBOs, to facilitate development of a membership roster, to facilitate additional services for their members or projects. And I'd like to have you review that.
Wrap up.
Oh, the last thing. Throughout the ordinance, the word storefront collective dispensary, and the word dispensary are used interchangeably. As you're discussing storefront collective dispensaries, where collective members go to a particular location, i.e. a storefront, to buy or receive medication, I'd like to request that the word storefront collective dispensary be used and further defined so that no ambiguity exists between a storefront collective dispensary or a collective that does not have a storefront.
Thank you very much. Okay, so staff, do you want to respond to any of those concerns or at this point? Mr. Wiley?
Mr. Chair, well, a general response. And in this actually, I think, responds to a lot of comments. As I see it, what we're dealing with here is the state law, the Compassionate Use Act of 1996 and the SB 420 statutes. They allow something to happen, and we're not going to change those laws. We can't do it here, and we can't preempt those laws. We can't, in fact, even do anything that conflict with those laws. And those laws deal with a much broader subject. I think we discussed the fact that essentially the Compassionate Use Act and these statutes deal with primarily with individuals on a one-on-one basis or small groups of individuals who decide to cultivate marijuana for themselves, whether they're as qualified patients or because they're primary caregivers. This could be even on a family basis or a social network basis among friends. We're not regulating that because we can't. That's all controlled by the state. And that in a way is an answer to the question about whether this ordinance deals with delivery services. No, it doesn't deal with delivery services. This ordinance is dealing with the one subset of all of this that we can deal with, and apparently we are being asked to deal with, and that's storefronts, storefront dispensaries, that public location. That, but for the fact that this should be done right in accordance with state law, the storefronts appear to be stores selling things. That they don't maybe have big signs, but some of them do advertise. And so we're trying to get to the essence of what state law allows, not be in conflict with it, clarify it, maybe amplify it in a way that clarifies it, maybe ask for more detail so that we can verify that someone's complying with state law with respect to these storefronts, so that they're not actually retailing medical marijuana. That's my answer to the delivery question. We don't deal with it because it's dealt with in state law. There is a misimpression on this, the definition of a collective, because the definition clearly says people who gather together collectively to distribute the collectively cultivated marijuana to the members of the collective at a storefront location. So they not only cultivate it collectively, they gather together to distribute it collectively at a storefront location. That's right in the definition. That's all we're dealing with. So we're not dealing with the family or the social network situation where they distribute it somehow, maybe at a get together or something like that. Compensation. I guess I didn't quite follow that question, so I can't respond to that. But again, we've got a very subjective definition, and like the question about redistribution, illegal redistribution of medical marijuana, it's a matter of proof. We're going to require the records, and if the police department basically has probable cause to investigate a violation of the law, they're going to investigate that. They're going to follow up on that probable cause. And they, as any police investigation, they assemble certain items of proof. And if we find that in an instance of someone receiving a six-figure bonus, that's a piece of proof that someone is not actually operating on a not-for-profit basis, and that there is more going on than simply reimbursement for expenses and reasonable compensation in this collective. Oh, and the question of collective versus cooperative. The state law clearly allows, it says, qualified patients, persons with valid ID cards, and designated primary caregivers may associate, or who associate within the state in order to collectively or cooperatively to cultivate marijuana for medical purposes shall not solely on that basis be subject to criminal sanctions. So state law uses the term collectively or cooperatively associate. A co-op is a defined term just like a corporation is. You'll find it in the California Corporations Code. And a co-op has to register with the Secretary of State's office, and they've got to designate officers. And just like a corporation, there's certain tax filings, or a nonprofit corporation, there's certain tax filings you have to make. There's no question that a co-op is the more formal, expressly defined term. But this state law says you can either gather together collectively or cooperatively. And I would be concerned that if the suggestion is that we only allow co-ops because we would have a better handle on who's involved, that might be in conflict with this state law. The Attorney General's guidelines spend a great deal of discussion on making it clear that collectives how they would define a collective and that the law allows collectives. So in this ordinance, the term collective is used, but it includes both. We just didn't want to, through the entire ordinance, put collective/cooperative. So the definition defines it once as both, and then we use the term. The same is true for the use of the term storefront collective dispensary, which is the general term. Sometimes we just, in the same sentence, we don't want to repeat that phrase all the time, so we use only the word dispensary. And it's capitalized. I think the meaning is pretty clear. So.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Mr. Hotchkiss?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Subject of preschool is interesting. These are pretty young kids. I think the idea of schools was people that might illegally use marijuana, and the preschoolers don't qualify. Am I off base in this? Is that why we agreed?
Chair White, Councilmember Hotchkiss, yes, that's essentially correct. I would have said that most likely kids who are going to preschool are being dropped off by adults, and they're more closely supervised than elementary or high school kids would be.
Okay, thank you. Did we settle the question about sale? Oh, somebody brought that up, wanted to exclude the use of the word sale. I think we came to an agreement on what that was, did we not? And it was an exchange of goods, whether it's money or something else, that was reasonable in light of payment for services rendered.
I think this ordinance is clear that the for-profit sale of medical marijuana is prohibited in accordance with state law. And I guess we're quibbling over the use of the term sale.
Yeah.
You know, you could come up with a different term, the transfer of medical marijuana under circumstances where reimbursement for expenses and reasonable compensation is allowed. But that's quite a mouthful. So I think this ordinance at least two sections makes it clear that the only thing that can happen is it makes it clear that for-profit sales of medical marijuana are prohibited. And again, that's state law is real clear about that as well.
Okay. All right, good. Let's go to something that Mr. Cato brought up, which was who wants to make the decision on these? Do we want to leave it up to staff, or do we want to bring it back in a more formal process? Because these strictures are pretty strict, my feeling is leave it to staff. What do you gentlemen think?
Mr. House, you want to comment on that?
Well, one of the things that I've definitely come around on since we had our first discussions is that I do believe that whichever approach we use, it should be appealable to the City Council. So I feel comfortable with that, and I think we're on the right track with that. And I was reassured by our staff report that could happen whichever model we use.
Right.
I just have to remember, and Mr. White was there, I watched you on when you were discussing this at Planning Commission, the tremendous discomfort that was expressed by each planning commissioner about being in the position of trying to make this kind of a decision. The findings, you're grappling with trying to find what findings, upon what basis are you even asking us. I think the most important thing is that we've established a very thorough set of regulations that a staff hearing officer or somebody who's at that level or within our staff can make, with the help of the police department, obviously they'll be in that process as well, can make the determination that fulfills our requirements.
Right.
And then if there's a challenge to that, then that could come to City Council.
I'm in agreement with that.
Okay, and what I'm not clear on, I don't know of another example of this. How would a staff decision get appealed to the City Council? I guess I should ask Mr. Wiley then. Is that like a building? Permit?
We would just put it in this ordinance. The staff hearing officer is a fairly new concept for the city, but there's no particular reason why this ordinance couldn't say that within 10 days of the formal issuance of a decision by the staff hearing officer, if someone files an appeal with the city clerk's office, the decision is nullified or at least suspended pending an appeal by the hearing by the City Council.
So it would be the yellow sign would go up on the property, the notice would be going to neighbors, and then a decision would be made, permit issued, an appeal occurs, and it can go to council. That's the...
Mr. Chair, that's a good question about something. Do we do the yellow signage on this, Danny? Is that's a separate section, I think.
It's not in this code, but the yellow sign is required anytime there's a discretionary application. So
wouldn't be a discretionary
remains at the staff hearing officer. I mean, one thing I heard you say is maybe it stays at the staff hearing officer, bypasses planning commission, goes to council, but we're also talking about no discretionary review and only be at a staff decision that would then be appealable to the council, right? Yeah. And we could put that. I mean, if you wanted to do that and you wanted notification of neighbors, that could be part of this process as well.
How does a pharmacy do it? Like if there's a pharmacy, not a building permit, that they're not going to build, they're going to occupy a facility and there's going to be a pharmacy going in there. What's the noticing requirement for that?
There is none.
And the same thing's true, but they have to fulfill certain requirements. So I guess we don't vet that at the city level, though, do we?
Correct. Those are federal requirements, as far as I know. There are no special city requirements for pharmacies, other than just meet basic zoning.
I see. And do we have any other kind of besides building permits? That's one world. Do we have any other kind of use that would be anywhere similar to this? I mean, even a liquor store. What does it require? I mean, this is different, obviously.
Right. It doesn't require anything from the city other than a building permit or perhaps design review for the...
It goes through ABC and all that stuff, and then the police department's involved in commenting on that.
Yes.
But there could be no formal appeal process if it were just a tenant improvement within a building that a liquor store or pharmacy goes in. There would be no appeal process. So that's why that's the line of questioning that I'm taking is I don't know of a ministerial act that is appealable to city council, and also that the notification process is complete as well. That's another thing I'm hearing that on a ministerial act that we wouldn't have the yellow sign up necessarily unless it were in this ordinance, and we wouldn't be noticing the neighbors normally if it were just a tenant improvement, for example.
Yes, that's correct, unless it's specially put into
unless it's put in here.
Yes.
So.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'm not clear on this. See, I think maybe the staff hearing officer chapter requires the yellow sign.
Yes.
Yeah, I just don't know offhand, and I'd have to dig around to figure it out. It does.
Yeah.
And then does the staff hearing officer chapter require radius noticing? Okay.
Yeah.
So we're covered.
No, we're not. In other words, what I'm hearing you two say is not a ministerial decision. Leave it to staff. Now, leave it to staff hearing officer. That's a discretionary process. It's kind of like a mini planning commission.
Right. That's what I'm referring to.
Oh,
that's
okay.
what I mean.
Oh, okay. Well,
Mr. House, are you
that's
comfortable with that?
That's different than what
I
you.
do
Well,
think
here's
this is a special situation.
the key to this is that somebody in a city is reviewing chapter and verse this for compliance and asking the questions like Mr. Cotto said. Well, how are you going to make sure that there's no redistribution? You know, we need to have somebody in our process do that, and I think that happens at a staff hearing officer level, which would have some noticing, and then it could be appealable directly to City Council. Maybe Mr. Cato's got something better there.
It's not better. I just want to clarify what happens. Right now, the ordinance says that the permit is heard by and approved or denied by the staff hearing officer, and then it's appealable to planning commission, and that's it. So what happens, we get an application, my staff, looks at the application, compares it to the ordinance, asks the questions, how are you going to meet all these requirements? And then we go do a site visit with the police department and the building department, and we make sure that everything is going to work out okay. And then we write a staff report, and we make a recommendation to the staff hearing officer, and then that is a public discretionary process that is we put a legal ad in the paper, we notify a radius of 300 feet, and then the staff hearing officer makes a decision, and that decision then is appealable. So from what Councilmember Hotchkiss is saying, I think he's saying that he wants to keep that process, that discretionary process, but perhaps bypass the planning commission and the appeal and go straight to the council. I think
that's right. And the reason I say that is because we're the ones that are crafting this thing. So rather than ask another body to interpret it, there's going to be an appeal. I would be happy to have it brought to the council.
And that's a fairly common. That's the process for ADR SFDB, is it not?
Chair White, that is the process for design review boards, but it's not the current process for staff hearing officer. Staff hearing
Understand.
officer gets to go to planning commission first. So yeah, there are plenty of processes that go straight to council.
All right, I got some other things
Yeah,
I want to
go
ask
for it.
about if I
Sure.
could here. I just want to clarify one thing on page 3 that we talk about the following things are not included in this ordinance, and this is for public consumption, which is a health care facility licensed pursuant blah, 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 a residential care facility for persons with chronic life-threatening illness, residential care facility for the elderly licensed pursuant to certain chapters, and a residential hospice. So those locations, in addition to what we're coming up with here, can issue medical marijuana or cannabis, whatever we're calling it. Okay, so this is a little bit an answer to Grant's concern of, gee, maybe people won't have access. Clearly, particularly people that are not even mobile will have access. On page, this is sort of a niggling point. On page 13 at the bottom, 28.80.080, item C3, it says only collective members as primary caregivers or qualified patients shall be permitted within a storefront. Okay, fine. We settled the workman's issue before. But let's say now I have not been part of this collective before and want to become a part of it. This sort of says, well, you can't go in there. So should we add, with the exception of a first-time use or something? Do you follow what I'm saying?
There's another section that deals with that first-time use.
Does there? I don't know if there is.
Is that right, Mr. Wiley? Isn't it?
That's my recollection. I'm not sure it deals with quite this point, though, about how you go to someplace you're not supposed to go to.
For the first time.
For the first
On the
time.
next page, on 4, the last part of that paragraph.
Without first having obtained.
Right. They shall become a member of the collective upon their first visit, so it identifies it.
Okay,
Plus-
so that probably covers that.
And there is a practice, and I think we have it very clearly identified, as I recall. There's the vestibule, if you will, where you go in and you present your recommendation, and you have to go through the whole process. I think we've covered that.
I just want to be sure we're covered. That's
I
fine.
think that does cover it.
Okay, fine. Page 16, item F, numbers 1 and 2, these seem to me contradictory because one says, with the approval of the staff hearing officer, collective dispensary may conduct or engage in the commercial sale of specific products, goods, etc. And then the next paragraph says, no collective dispensary shall sell or display any drug paraphernalia. Well, on the one hand, this seems to me to be saying, hey, you can sell it. And the other says, well, you can't show it. So how are you going to sell it if you can't show it, just from a practical point of view?
Mr. Hotchkiss, this sort of comes under the general rule for statutes that the specific controls the general. So number 1 is general, and it says you can sell specific products, goods, or services that you propose, and the city says that's okay. And I think people, for example, said they wanted to sell some books and stuff. But 2 is real specific, and not dealing with drug paraphernalia. That's pipes and things like that would be prohibited.
All right, I didn't get that. Okay. All right, now there's, hold on a second, let me get my notes here. Okay. On section 28.80.0 70, page 11, B4, it says that the issuance of a collective dispensary permit for the collective dispensary size requested is appropriate to meet needs of the community for access to medical marijuana. I think this goes back to what Mr. House was talking about, places around the city that were for convenience of people. So if we have one in the east side or west side or wherever, it's not going to be a 4,000 square foot operation. It's going to be something that's appropriate to the populace that it's meant to serve. Am I interpreting this correctly so far?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then the next paragraph says that issuance of the collective dispensary permit would serve the needs of city residents within a proximity to this location. That, again, is an effort, I think, to try to control the size and the population served. So then that brings me back to something that Tony, I think, brought up, Mr. Vasallo, about what population are we really trying to serve here? We're the elected officials for Santa Barbara. So we do have a vocal minority, and it's important and needs to be served, people with a medical need of all of us who either have that need ourselves or have friends with it. But are we not opening a door that previously we agreed to close by saying that we really need to serve a larger population? We're elected officials from a city elected to serve the population that is our electorate. And I'm wondering if we should, and this is radical, so I'm asking you gentlemen to reconsider and reject if you wish, but we really should think that our duty here is to serve our city. Having said that, there are several dispensaries now open in Goleta, which apparently satisfies that area, and several in Summerlin. So we're not exclusive here, and we're not, if we don't open this up to everybody, people with a need who are not in the city cannot be served. But I do think that our responsibility, because we have strong emotions, even in this room, very conflicting, those that are anxious to make medical marijuana readily available to those in need, and those who are equally anxious to limit it only to those people, that we should look at what we said before and make it such a broad market. I know that's, I'm backtracking a little bit, and I appreciate that's asking you gentlemen to make a new consideration, but I hope that you'll at least think about that, maybe discuss it. Thank you.
Well, and is your suggestion that that dispensaries be limited to dispensing, collectively to city residents only? Is that?
Yeah, I think because that's
the position you're advocating?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, okay. Because I reconsider what we were elected to do, which is to serve the people of Santa Barbara, and B, because there's such strong emotions both ways, we would, as somebody said, be best served if we erred on the side of caution. Thank you.
Mr. House, you have a... wait a minute. I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
Why don't you go through your list of stuff, and then we'll...
I think I'm almost done.
Okay.
No, I think that's it, because Mr. House covered the other stuff first.
Okay.
Thank you.
So... why don't I have my turn here, Mr. House, and then we'll come back and do round two. I, like Mr. Hotchkiss, have one curveball to throw at my colleagues, and that is, it came up late in our last hearing, and actually was responding even to one of Mr. Vasallo's emails, and I returned to my earlier position of not supporting the downtown areas as having as being eligible for dispensaries. So that's, at least at this point, a concern of mine. Another area that I sent an email to Mr. Wiley about, and that I would feel more comfortable, even if it's not today, but getting a sense of, as it comes to council, is the business of compensation. And what we have language in here that talks about reasonable compensation, and my question to Mr. Wiley was, what's reasonable if today? As inflation occurs and times change, what that dollar amount will be is going to change. But today, what would that be? And we don't have that number, and I would think that would be something that would be reassuring to council. It would be reassuring to me if I had a sense of range of compensation going forward. So I don't know whether we could have any hope for that to come back to go to council if this does move forward, but it is something that I hope for. There's a stealth typo on page 12 and number 9. That's just the computer. The second sentence, just FYI. Affect and effect. I do feel that I'm interested in Mr. Hotchkiss's comment about the city residents. My gut feeling is, having, for example, grown up patronizing stores on Milpa Street and living in Montecito, I just feel uncomfortable limiting it to the city of Santa Barbara. I could go with the county of Santa Barbara, and I think that the whole sort of, there's been one of the themes has been Santa Barbara as a marijuana tourist destination, and I think that would start to head in the direction of solving that concern. And then I'd get back to another comment that I have is I'm sorry that Mr. Wiley couldn't come up with a way to make the 3100 State Street option a viable one, but I need to go with our council on that on that call. So I would just as soon keep it simpler, but I know that Mr. Weston understands. Another area that I'm concerned about is the costs to the city of managing this thing, and that there's going to be all the supervision and investigation and stuff. And I don't want us to not be able to fund crossing guards because we are managing marijuana dispensaries. This needs to get as close to self-sustaining as we can possibly make. And I appreciate that we're not. The city planning system is subsidized by the general fund, always has been, more than any other department that I know of that I've ever worked in. So I appreciate that we're not going to get all the way there, but I'd like that to be looked at, and as this moves forward, I would like to hear that we're covering the basis of cost pretty darn well after we get done with this, because I know this is extremely expensive and just what we're doing right now, and then but from here forward. So that's a big concern of mine. So what I'm hearing too is that what we're really talking about is that this stays with the staff hearing officer. That just sounds like that's the comfort level that two of us are at, and I hope that Mr. House would share in that. And I'm okay with it hopscotching over Planning Commission, again for simplicity's sake, and going to Council. And if Council wants to refer it back to Planning Commission for land use issues, that can occur. But at least that would keep it simpler and get to the heart of the matter more quickly. So that's how I'd suggest it occur. All right. So those are my comments at this point, Mr. House.
Yes, thank you very much.
Back to round two.
So, Mr. Chair, so I came today with a whole lot of okays here because I was looking to see that Mr. Wiley had actually captured our conversation accurately. And with the exception of those 3 points that I brought up earlier, and I suppose the typo that you referenced, I think he's done a pretty good job. And so I just want to say that. Now, if we're going to start all over again, I'm at the number 7, and I'm talking about the whole state.
I hear that.
I just want you to know. So if you guys want to roll the clock back and start reevaluating each one of these things as we go along, I've got a few chits to put into the game too. In fact, it's really a pragmatic thing, Mr. Hotchkiss, with regards to the geographic area. I think the concept was to make us be sensible with regards to the people that work here, for instance, in Santa Barbara, who come and spend their time here. They're commuting in. Also, the issue of where the actual cultivation is going to happen. First of all, you can't cultivate if you're not a member. So it's not like, as some suggested, that you would have cultivation being in a smaller or in a larger geographic area or smaller or whatever. They have to be concurrent. They have to be the same. So if you're suggesting the city of Santa Barbara, then you want to think that one through a little bit as to where exactly you were thinking the cultivation place is going to be. And if you're thinking of the county, you reflect back on the letter that we got of concern from our supervisor, and since some of us have talked with others in the county, and that may not be as big a concern, but certainly having a geographic range that is sufficient. Remember, we didn't go to L.A., talked about L.A., and that would be very legitimate for one of the organizations here in town because they already have had a 10-year working relationship with a dedicated single source, single customer grower in Los Angeles. I'd be very happy to leave it at that. But we all discussed it and decided we pull that in and keep it within the tri-counties. That's plausible to me. That's where you could have a member, that's the connection, the membership that would actually be coming to Santa Barbara within a limited geographic range that also could cultivate. That's where, to me, it balanced out those two things. So I know we need to discuss this, but I want to put that on so we can actually have that discussion again. And I have other things. I want to go over those other things, too. The issue of leaving out all of the downtown area. I'm struggling for the plausibility of that. We've done the one thing that was requested of us, which was we took a list from CATA of 17 facilities around which we wanted to draw a radius. We then identified the block faces using that approach as opposed to the zoning approach and got really specific. And that makes it so much easier for this processing by the staff hearing officer to make those determinations. I think we've done the job. The difference, this difference means that there's a section of town where there's normal commerce and real people are. In fact, there's a community here. There's neighbors that live here in our mixed-use area that will not, it'll just be left out. So I need to hear more of the rationale for that. I just don't get it. I thought we came up to the proper balance earlier. And I'm trying to see if it was the other, the money. I think that's the net. Mr. Wiley, you can help me with this process piece, but after we approve this, we then, as a city council, we then come back and then we deal with the fees, exactly what the fees are going to be. That's a separate resolution. Isn't that how that works? And we've all been talking about full cost recovery at every level. I mean, I completely concur with Mr. White on that.
Councilmember House, that's correct in terms of the permit processing in the annual review. And just to be clear, though, what I see occurring in recent years, particularly with state mandates, and this is a state mandate, is in this case it's the police, the role of the police department, the general fund department. Their role has been increased on a day-to-day basis, and something like this, they're going to be a big player. And that's not the sort of thing that you're allowed to recoup in an application fee under Prop 218. And just you can't charge a fee for general governmental services. You can charge a fee for processing an application. So, because that's come up from time to time. So, this ordinance is very clear that we're going to recoup as much as we can, recoup our total cost for permit processing and for annual reviews.
Okay, very good. Now, so I just wanted to say I truly concur with that. And the best of our ability, we should be doing that. So I'm willing to move forward with what we have here, with the changes that we have. But I really don't want us to reopen all those cans of worms and go all the way back. At council level, it's de novo. We can have the big conversation. But
are you done? Okay, are you done? Okay, Mr. Hotchkiss. Round two.
Round two. No. My real concern about talking about limiting scope of area that we can market to, as it were, is that we don't want to develop what I have seen in, I hate to call it, but pot tourism, because I saw people, well, Grant, hold on a sec. I saw people stopped on the street in Cabrillo Boulevard, asked by the cops why they're there. It was another violation. And they'd come up from Oxnard, and they said, we came up to go to one of the dispensaries. So the way we have it right now is that same group could come up tomorrow, go in, present whatever card they got, get whatever marijuana they got, go home, and make it a practice. To avoid that, consider the following, that we have a sort of one-day waiting period so that if somebody comes up and does that, they cannot right then get their marijuana. They would have to come back another time. The only reason that 24 hours later, the reason I suggest that is that it takes the convenience factor out of it. It makes it 24 hours less convenient for somebody immediately local, but it would at least avoid the problem that I'm trying to avoid, which is this sort of tourist aspect. Tell me what you think.
Mr. Chair? It's an interesting proposition.
It is an interesting proposition.
I mean, we're dealing with a state that actually has a statewide card. You know that, right? So it's the whole state. That's their area. The idea of a waiting period, is it practicable? I'm looking at staff now. Can we see it? Would we have an issue, I mean, from a staff perspective, with there being some kind of a waiting period for?
Just to make sure I understand the suggestion, it's that a let's just say non-city resident.
Well, a new collective member. Somebody that want to be a collective member.
Well, the waiting period for joining a collective is I've seen that in several ordinances. We don't have it in here yet, but that is. This ordinance does contain a requirement. You can only be a member of one collective. So once you're a member, that's your collective, and that's where you're supposed to be going. And I guess we could add a waiting period as well for joining a collective, and that really seems to me gets to avoiding the retailing of medical marijuana, and really gets more to this concept of collectively joining together in providing marijuana to the members.
So 24-hour. I mean, right now what they do is they actually take the recommendation. If I understand it correctly, take this recommendation. They contact the doctor who prescribed it or recommended it. Who should be on a verified list already. I mean, there's a whole lot of checks and balances in the process as it is right now. I guess it's not the end of the world. The main thing is that I think that there needs to be a plausible geographic area. If that addresses your concern, I think we can put it into our thing. 24 hours.
Yeah, I think for anybody who comes in as the first time, they got a 24-hour period, and it will take away the impulse buy, if I can put it that way, or at least discourage it. If you're happy with that, I'd like to propose that.
I like it. And I'm okay. I think you're making some good points about, for example, what is the functional community here? It is, Ventura is certainly, it's closer than Santa Maria, which would be in our county. So I can picture even I guess then San Luis is a viable growing spot, is why you're going to Tri-County. So I like the 1 day waiting period, staff hearing officer. I'm needing to, I know that I won't make any headway with Mr. House on the downtown spot, as that's been unattractive to Mr. House since the day I suggested it 6 weeks ago, or whatever it was, 2 months ago. But the reason that I say that is I feel like just as I've been advocating for making eligible the West Side medical community as one of our spots, I feel like those will work. Milpas is more the site of opportunity at this point. It's got the dispensaries. I'm uncomfortable, as I think I've said in the previous hearing, I'm uncomfortable that we have as many as we do in the Milpas area. I wish we had one, and I include Olive Street in that as well. So I think that people can get medical cannabis without using the downtown area conveniently.
Did you make a motion?
I don't, that's the job that you guys got to do. So, but I put that out there as what I would support. And I think that we've got the Tri-County residents, staff hearing officer, 1-day waiting period. We've had the corrections that and amendments that Mr. House has made. And as I say, for me, I had been advocating the no downtown area until your ninth inning motion of our last hearing. And so I just, in the name of compromise, I was heading there, and I just find myself being uncomfortable with it when I thought about it, just as you were rethinking a couple of things today yourself, Mr. Hotchkiss. So that's what got me back to where I was to begin with. And I'm sorry I didn't have the spine to hang tough on my decision of a month ago. But I don't. It just take a stroke of the pen to take that out. And
Are you looking for a motion, Mr. Chair?
I am now.
Mr. Chair, can I mention one point? Mr. Weston brought up about concern about edibles, and I see this as possibly being an appropriate clarification that could be done fairly simply, and that's the bakery or business that processes the edibles. If the committee is inclined, we could add a paragraph, I would suggest at section 100 on page 19, that would say an individual or business who assists a dispensary, a permitted dispensary, in preparing and processing edible marijuana, medical marijuana products will be deemed by the city as an individual who provides, it's right out of state law, assistance to a qualified patient or a person with an identification card in administering medical marijuana to the qualified patient, as that phrase is used in Health and Safety Code 11362.765. So we'd just be really cross-referencing the state law and saying a bakery who did this would be someone who is providing assistance in administering marijuana. And I could see that as being something that might be reassuring to a business that was asked to prepare that product. So.
Okay, so then that will be something for the motion maker to consider and putting in. It sounds reasonable to me. But
Happy to make a motion. Incorporating the language that Mr. Wiley just said, I'd like to make a motion that also incorporates the 3-county area of Mr. Howe's, the 24-hour waiting period that I suggested, and the no downtown area dispensaries that Mr. White suggested. And everything else I think we have gone over.
Well, the SRO, the staff hearing officer level of approval appealable to City Council. I think that was fundamental in our discussion today.
Absolutely.
I'm reticent to second a motion that continues to eliminate all of downtown. We've already identified specific block faces, and
I understand.
What I would propose we do is let's have a straw vote on that so that we can send something forward, and then we, because I think we're almost there, and I think that issue can be raised at council.
Well, I don't know that I'll support any motion that includes an absolute a downtown off limits. That just doesn't make any sense to me. What I want, and when it first came up, I had an immediate reaction to that. It made absolutely no sense. I still don't hear a rationale for it. I hear a predilection, but that's quite different from a real rationale. What's the benefit to the public? And I don't see one in any way. If it's such a restricted area in any case, but we've identified those areas, and there is a downtown community. It's not like it's just, closes up at night and goes home. This is a neighborhood, just like any other part of town.
Right. May I address that?
Hotchkiss?
It is sort of the party area of town, and I think that maybe Mr. White is being cautious in not wanting to have marijuana readily mixable with somebody been down at the bars on Lower State Street. I'm just projecting here. On the other hand, I think Mr. Cato, you said that using the other criteria that we mapped out before, that about 75% of the downtown area, including the State Street corridor, is perforce not eligible for dispensary. Is that correct?
Chair White, Councilmember Hotchkiss, if you look at the overhead, this shows the current area in the downtown east and west. It's mostly west, but towards the upper right is the downtown east. That shows where they're currently allowed. I neglected to put in the State Street prohibition on this map, but State Street is runs right.
Right, the spine of it there, yeah.
So it would exclude a couple of these parcels. It would exclude a couple of these parcels right here. But basically, this is all that's left in downtown after the 17 highest priority recovery facilities.
Those areas not in green is what you're talking about. Is
Correct.
What's left.
The pink area.
Pink.
Except the whole quarter of State Street.
Oh, just the pink. Okay.
Just the pink.
All right. Well, I don't think this should be a deal killer, honestly.
Okay, well, make your motion.
So I'll go along with Mr. Housen. We'll not put in the exclusion of the downtown blanket area, but excluded, understood, with all those areas now delineated. Is that clear enough? I don't know. Is this motion clear enough for staff to go forward if we get it agreed upon?
Unless I'm misunderstanding, I think the motion would be the attachment that we've got, the list that we've got. Is that, yeah.
Are we happy with that, gentlemen? Can we get a second or a vote?
Well,
I mean, there's a motion. Do I have a second?
yes, and I will second that. And I'm looking real carefully over all the things that have been discussed today and we've heard brought up to be sure that all these issues have been
Actually, I'm going to ask you both that we start over. Would you withdraw your second, please, Mr. Hassan? Would you withdraw your motion for the moment? I want to ask for a straw vote on the location, and then I will be able to support and after we do that.
Okay, I'll withdraw it temporarily here.
Temporarily.
Whatever, suspend it. Whatever. Sure.
Yes, suspended. Okay. So I would ask for a straw vote on the whether to have the downtown corridor removed from sale. All those in favor, raise your hand. Okay. So I'm a minority of that on that issue. Now, a motion on the.
Or just bring my emotion to the floor again.
Okay.
And second.
Okay. All those in favor say aye.
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 Okay. Opposed? All right. We have a recommendation to council for a medical marijuana ordinance.
I have a process question I'd like to ask our staff, if I may.
You may.
Okay. We at City Council had given this to us to wrestle these issues to the ground, particularly the definition issue, which we've really gone over and discussed, and we've even gone further probably than we were asked to, but we've really tightened this up. Doesn't this just go back to City Council? Oh, Mr. Wiley. I mean, I was surprised to see that up there. Isn't this just go back to Council?
Councilmember House, you know, the state planning law is actually fairly specific about this, and it does say that if any substantive changes in a draft ordinance are made after the first Planning Commission review, then it has to go back to the Planning Commission. And recently was actually a case involving another city where they kind of didn't follow that very strictly, and the ordinance was invalidated. So I hate to make that mistake. And
I was just thinking of the promise we'd made in terms of time, and I remember 2 weeks ago when we talked about this, I don't think that came up, and we've been given those 60 days and all that, so that's what I was bringing it up for.
Okay. Well, this will then go back to the Planning Commission, and you said when, Mr. Cato?
Chair White, May 13th is when we've scheduled it, and we'll
13th.
get back to council as soon as we can after that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank the attendees and the people who have participated in this. I certainly hear the concerns of, again, as Mr. Hotchkiss says, a component of our community who is very concerned about any dispensaries at all. And I am hoping that the various restrictions will minimize the risk of this. And I thank all of you for your participation.
Yeah. Thank you.